By 1944, Glenn Miller was one of the biggest stars in the entire world. He and his popular orchestra had already made hits for years, even outselling names like Elvis or the Beatles in hit record sales during their peak. But what if we told you that such an influential name in music like Glenn Miller has been missing for nearly 80 years? In the Mood, Moonlight Serenade, Chattanooga Choo Choo. Glenn Miller and his orchestra skyrocketed to fame with these titles through the 1930s and early 1940s, and that's only to name a few. He was born on March 1st, 1904, in Clarinda, Iowa, with an ear for music at a very young age. He learned to play trombone in high school, later working as a sideman in the 1920s for numerous bands, and then starting one of his own after dropping out of the University of Colorado. By the 1930s, Glenn Miller skyrocketed to fame. He produced over 100 recordings and tunes that remained in the top 10 charts. In short, you can't mention the swing and big band era without mentioning Glenn Miller. Miller once said, "It's not enough for me to sit back and buy war bonds. I'm going into this war, coming out some kind of hero." Like many prominent names in music and film at the time, Glenn Miller sought to join the armed forces in any way he could, even if it meant putting his prosperous career on pause. And in the summer of 1942, Glenn Miller made his first attempt to do just that. He applied for a commission for the U.S. Navy, but was unfortunately rejected in that effort. This wouldn't stop the star, though, especially with the Army eager to bring Miller in with open arms because of his celebrity status. So, with a second attempt, the U.S. Army welcomed him in and commissioned him as a captain. Miller reported for duty officially on October 7, 1942. He was transferred to the USAAF, or the United States Army Air Forces. He became the director of bands for the USAAF, leading and organizing military bands. It may seem like a small gesture from the outside, but Glenn Miller made this sacrifice to provide a little slice of home to the troops overseas, conducting a series of concerts, shows, and radio broadcasts. In fact, upon joining the military, Glenn willingly made a significant financial loss to his usual civilian pay, going from earning somewhere around $15,000 to $20,000 per week to only $250 per month, which is roughly $3,000 annually. The Glenn Miller Army Air Force Band was a success, a staple of World War II media, and it was apparent that the band leader was in it for the long haul. At this point during the war, Paris had recently been liberated from the occupying German forces. With the help of the French resistance and Allied forces, the country regained its freedom, marking a pivotal moment in the conflict. Morale was high, and none other than the Glenn Miller Air Force Band was slated to perform there for a live broadcast on December 19, 1944. He was in England at the time performing for the troops there, though the band would travel to Paris separately from Miller due to his status as an active member of the military. He still had his duties to perform as well as managing the band, so for logistical reasons, Miller had to stay behind. The larger factor causing this flight delay was the sketchy weather conditions. There were low clouds and dangerously impeding visibility over the English Channel. In fact, cloud coverage that day was predicted to cover between 6/10 and 10/10 of up to about 24,000 feet into the air, which increases the chances of pilot disorientation much higher. Perhaps even more dangerous was the potential for low temperatures, threatening the possibility of freezing rain, an extremely dangerous feature that could cause important parts of aircraft to ice over, including the wings. However, these were still acceptable flight conditions for the time being, but they were expected to deteriorate. Frustrated by these cancellations, Miller picked up the phone and made an arrangement with Lieutenant Colonel Norman Basel of 8th Air Force Service Command at Milton Ernest. The lieutenant happened to be flying to France on the 15th and, likely to Glenn's relief, invited him aboard for the trip. The next day, a UC-64A Norseman landed at RAF Trinwood Farm near Bedfordshire at around 1:45 p.m., piloted by Flight Officer John Stuart Morgan. Miller and Lieutenant Colonel Basel boarded the small plane and took off for France about 10 minutes later. Miller and everyone aboard that flight were never seen again. This flight was completely unauthorized, but with a growing eagerness to catch up with his fellow bandmates, the bandleader made a decision that would unfortunately be his last. Glenn Miller never reported his intentions to any military superiors, so although Basil's presence aboard the craft was scheduled, Miller's whereabouts were completely unknown to officials. This lack of knowledge kept the 8th Air Force in the dark about the plane's status, until December 18th, a whole 3 days later. A search and investigation were held after these developments, but sadly, not a single trace of the plane or its occupants was found. The last confirmed sighting of the UC-65A Norseman being spotted near Beachy Head, East Sussex, only moments after taking off. The Glenn Miller Orchestra, having already made it to Paris, would not receive official word about their leader's vanishing until the 24th of December, leaving them in the dark. Serving as a Christmas broadcast, the show would go on, but with Major William A. Bill McCauley taking Miller's stead in the meantime. Sadly, it wouldn't be until later that word would be official that Glenn Miller and everyone on that plane was lost.
Major Glenn Miller, the well-known American bandleader, is reported missing. He left England by air for Paris 9 days ago. Major Glenn Miller came over from the States early this year to direct the American band of the AEF, which has often been heard playing in the Allied Expeditionary Forces program of the BBC.
A musical legend that left a poignant mark in history in such a short time had been sent to eternity. Initially, all signs point to something going wrong due to the aforementioned weather conditions. Visibility was definitely an issue in the fog, but the leading theory points to freezing rain as the main culprit. Many components of an airplane this size could be affected by it, and Dennis Sprague of the Glenn Miller Archive believes that the fuel intake froze, leading to engine failure. The craft was likely flying at a low altitude when this happened, in which event the pilot would only have 8 seconds to react before the craft took a complete nosedive. In this scenario, combined with the lightweight structure of the Norseman, the plane would have disintegrated on impact, killing all occupants instantly. And even though this is the most grounded of all theories, others have shared over the years that details a more tragic, even more nefarious reason as to why the plane never reached its destination. The following theory also takes the weather of that day into account, suggesting that Allied bombers might have destroyed the plane by accident when returning from a failed raid on Germany. In 2000, a logbook that went up for auction from RAF flight engineer Derek Thurman featured interesting notes about an unknown plane in the area that day. Thurman told the BBC, quote, "Nobody anticipated there being an aircraft there at all. There was a shout that there was someone there. The navigator shot out of his seat to look up and saw it whip by, and the rear gunner said, 'It's gone in,' flipped over and gone in. Whether it was brought down by a blast from a bomb or was hit is anyone's guess." End quote. There have been other quotes from sources that corroborate the potential of Miller's plane going down via friendly fire, but the theory altogether is highly contested. Technically, the altitude in which the bombers would have been flying was thousands of feet higher than the Norseman plane and almost completely out of sight to actually witness. As stated before, the conditions of the sky that day were far too blinding to make a solid conclusion. Miller, Glenn's own brother, suggested that the music star's disappearance wasn't accidental, but rather intentional. A musician himself, Erb is convinced that Glenn had died of cancer instead. In fact, he's also convinced that his brother never even got on the plane in the first place. He allegedly quoted, "My own theory for years was that he never even left England, but died somewhere of cancer. I have never believed in the story that my brother died in a plane crash." End quote. Erb remained convinced that Glenn's plane crash story was purposely concocted to create a hero spectacle. Erb Miller also suggested that his brother sent him a letter in the summer of 1944 containing the following: "I am totally emaciated. Although I am eating enough, I have trouble breathing. I think I am very ill." End quote. It was true that there have been instances that raise questions about Miller's health at that time. In fact, a British radio director recalled Glenn saying to him, "You know, George, I have an awful feeling you guys are gonna go home without me." Don Haynes, Miller's military aide, also noted that he was indeed losing a significant amount of weight in those final days. There are compelling claims by people who were close to him, but none of them have been confirmed, nor was this letter that his brother allegedly received ever recovered. Could Glenn Miller have actually died in England from cancer, with the media being fed a cover story this entire time? And if so, what happened with the body? Another, even more outlandish theory suggests that Miller's purpose overseas was a lot more than just playing music and boosting morale. It suggests that the band leader was working as a spy for the United States on behalf of Dwight D. Eisenhower. The theory comes with a mixture of details surrounding Miller and the state of the war at that given time, putting forth that the superstar's fluency in German and close ties with military-connected actor David Niven could point to a covert operation taking place instead. With the Battle of the Bulge set to occur just a day after the disappearance, it's rumored that Miller may have been sent to negotiate the surrender of high-ranking Nazi officials, hoping that his influence could sway their decisions, ultimately failing. The story here is that when Germany was notified of these talks, Miller was then assassinated by the Nazis to prevent that from ever happening. Enter the story of the airplane to cover the truth. But in 1987, something interesting happened. On the English coast, approximately 30 miles south of Portland Bill, a fisherman, while trawling for a catch, unknowingly pulled in wreckage from a World War II-era plane. He called the Coast Guard to report the strange finding. But when he told them he believed there was wreckage from the Second World War, they advised him to return the parts back into the sea, believing it was considered a war grave. This could have remained an insignificant footnote of a story, but years later, the same fisherman saw an image of the ill-fated Norseman that Miller was last seen in. This was a startling revelation, prompting him to contact researchers and aviation historians to look into what he witnessed. With the help of the International Group of Historic Aircraft Recovery, or TIGHAR, the location where the fisherman claimed to have discovered the wreckage was searched, but ultimately, it wasn't found again. There were doubts in the fisherman's claim by the TIGHAR regarding specific details, but if his story is true, one detail could prevail that solves the mystery unequivocally. The UC-64A Norseman is the only one of its kind to go missing during the war. If it's ever found in the English Channel again, it's safe to say we'll know who it belonged to. In the end, the Glenn Miller disappearance is yet another mysterious vanishing, akin to those of Amelia Earhart or D.B. Cooper, last seen on a plane, then never seen again. Wild theories or not, it's safe to assume that the ill-fated Norseman plane met its final end somewhere in the English Channel. The question is, over 80 years later, is there still hope that any remains of the aircraft or its passengers can be found? What exactly do you think happened on that foggy day in England? Poor decision-making? An accident? Or Is there something more to it?